The parish clerk's office in St. Bernard, Louisiana, had a peculiar smell. Not the expected mustiness of old paper and leather-bound volumes, but something sharper, like vinegar mixed with rust. Gerald Hutchins noticed it the moment he stepped through the heavy oak door on that humid morning in August 1893. He'd been hired to catalogue the parish's birth and death records dating back to 1820, a project the county commissioners had postponed for decades. Gerald was a methodical man. At 34, he'd already organized 3 parish archives across the state, earning a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. He wore the same gray vest every working day, carried his lunch in a tin pail, and never left a document unfiled. His wife, Caroline, often joked that he treated historical records with more tenderness than he showed most people. The clerk who handed him the keys was an elderly man named Albert, whose hands trembled slightly as he pointed toward the back room. "Most of what you need is in there," Albert said, his voice carrying an odd hesitation. "The older materials. Well, some boxes haven't been opened in my lifetime. 40 years I've worked here." "That's exactly what I'm here for," Gerald replied, setting down his leather satchel. Albert lingered at the doorway. "There's a section in the southeast corner. Previous clerks. They kept it separate. Special documents, they said." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "I was told to leave those alone. Just passing along what I was told." Gerald nodded politely, already mentally organizing his approach. He'd heard similar warnings before, usually about documents related to family disputes or contested wills. Nothing he couldn't handle with discretion. The back room stretched longer than it appeared from the entrance. Tall wooden shelves lined both walls, sagging under the weight of record books, bundled correspondence and dust-covered boxes. Light filtered through 2 narrow windows, creating columns of illuminated particles that danced in the stagnant air. He began with the accessible materials, birth registrations from the 1870s, neatly organized and relatively well preserved. The work progressed smoothly for the first 3 days. Gerald developed a rhythm: remove a volume, check the date range, note the condition, assign a catalog number, and move to the next. By Thursday afternoon, he'd processed nearly 200 volumes. Then he reached the southeast corner. The boxes there were different, older, constructed from a darker wood, and stacked in a configuration that suggested intentional concealment rather than simple storage. Someone had arranged them to create a barrier, a wall within the wall. Gerald had to move 7 boxes just to access the ones behind. The first box he opened contained standard plantation records, crop yields, equipment purchases, weather observations from various estates in the parish. Interesting from a historical perspective, but routine. The second box held similar materials. The third box was locked, not with a padlock or modern mechanism, but with a wax seal that had melted and re-hardened over the iron clasp. The seal bore an impression Gerald didn't recognize, 3 curved lines intersecting in a pattern that might have been initials or simply decorative. He hesitated. Breaking seals on historical documents was generally frowned upon, but his mandate was comprehensive cataloging. He carefully applied pressure to the clasp. The old wax crumbled, and the box opened with a dry creak. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had long since dried and cracked, were ledgers. 4 of them, each bound in brown leather with no titles or markings on the covers. Gerald lifted the first one gently. The spine was fragile, the pages yellowed, but still intact. He opened to the first page and read the handwritten heading: Register of Births, St. Bernard Parish, 1829-1834, Supplementary Records. Supplementary Records. He'd never encountered that designation before. The entries were organized in neat columns: date of birth, child's name, mother's name, father's name, if known, race, plantation of origin, and registrar. Standard information for the period. Gerald began scanning the entries, making notes about the condition and content. Then he noticed something strange. On page 12, an entry read, April 3rd, 1830, female child, Marie, mother Lisette, Negro, father unknown, race white, Belmont Plantation, registrar J. Armand. Gerald stopped. He read it again, certain he'd misunderstood. A child born to a Negro mother, listed as white. It had to be a clerical error. He continued reading. 3 entries later. April 27, 1830, male child, Thomas. Mother, Patience, Negro. Father, unknown, race, white, Belmont Plantation, registrar, J. Armand. Another one. He flipped forward, scanning faster now. His pulse quickened with each page. June 14th, 1830, female child, Rose. Mother, Dinah, Negro. Father, unknown, race, white, Riverside Estate, registrar, J. Armand, August 2, 1830, male child, Henry. Mother, Esther, Negro. Father, unknown, race, white, Oakwood Plantation, registrar, J. Armand. The pattern continued. Page after page, children born to enslaved mothers, designated as white, and every single entry signed by the same registrar, J. Armand. Gerald felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. He checked the date on the ledger again, 1829 to 1834. He opened the second ledger. The pattern continued through 1835 to 1841. Different plantations, different mothers, different children. Always the same racial designation. Always the same name signing off, J. Armand. By the time the afternoon light began fading, Gerald had documented 47 such entries across the 4 ledgers. 47 children born to enslaved mothers between 1829 and 1847, all registered as white, all certified by J. Armand. He sat back in his chair, mind racing. This wasn't random error. This was systematic. But why? Why would anyone register enslaved children as white? That evening, Gerald barely touched his supper. Caroline noticed immediately, setting down her fork with concern. "You look like you've seen something terrible." "Not terrible exactly," he said slowly. "Confusing. I found records today that don't make sense." He explained what he'd discovered, watching her expression shift from curiosity to disbelief to something darker. Recognition, perhaps, though she'd never studied Louisiana history particularly. "Could it have been a mistake?" she asked. "A clerk who didn't know the mothers? 47 times, across 18 years, same person signing every entry?" Gerald shook his head. "Someone knew exactly what they were doing. I just don't understand what or why." Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Maybe you shouldn't understand. Maybe that's why those boxes were hidden." Her words settled uncomfortably between them. Gerald had always approached historical work with detachment, events that happened long ago to people long dead. But this felt different. This felt deliberate. And that deliberateness implied purpose. "I need to find out who J. Armand was," he said finally. The Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge kept records of parish officials, clerks, registrars, and other administrative appointees. Gerald traveled there the following week, carrying his notes in a locked portfolio. The archivist, a stern woman named Mrs. Whitfield, directed him to the government appointment records. He found the name within an hour. Jacques Armand, appointed Deputy Registrar, St. Bernard Parish, January 1829, resigned, November 1847. 18 years, exactly matching the span of the mysterious ledgers. But there was more. Attached to the appointment record was a notation, added in different ink, apparently years later. Position dissolved following investigation. See Coroner's Inquiry, 1847, File 392. Gerald's hands trembled slightly as he requested File 392. Mrs. Whitfield returned with a thin folder, the pages inside brittle and brown at the edges. "This hasn't been accessed in decades," she remarked. "Are you researching something specific?" "Just trying to understand parish record-keeping practices," Gerald said. which was technically true. The coroner's inquiry was dated November 18, 1847. The subject, Jacques Armand, found deceased in his home at age 52. Cause of death, undetermined, possibly heart failure. But it was the testimony section that made Gerald's breath catch. A neighbor, Mrs. Violet Chenot, had testified that she'd gone to check on Armand after not seeing him for 3 days. She found him in his study, slumped over his desk. On the desk were papers. She couldn't read well, she'd testified, but she remembered seeing lists of names, children's names. The investigating deputy, a man named Robert Devereux, had noted, "Deceased's study contained extensive personal records related to parish registrations. Materials appeared to document births from 1829 to present, with notations regarding racial classifications and subsequent transfers. Documents were seized for review by parish authority. Transfers." Gerald underlined the word in his notes. The final page of the inquiry contained a brief addendum dated 3 months later. Investigation closed. Materials reviewed by parish commission. Records returned to archive storage. No criminal findings. No criminal findings. But what had they found? Gerald returned to St. Bernard with more questions than answers. He approached Albert at the clerk's office with a directness he usually avoided. "The name Jacques Armand, does that mean anything to you?" Albert's face paled visibly. He glanced around the empty office before lowering his voice. "How do you know that name?" "He was a registrar here, worked for 18 years. "He was more than a registrar," Albert said quietly. "My father worked in this office when I was a boy. He mentioned Armand once. Only once. Said some men do the devil's work with clean hands and legal papers." "What did he mean?" Albert shook his head. "Father never explained. But he told me if I ever found documents with Armand's signature, I should leave them be, that some history is better left buried." "But it's not buried," Gerald pressed. "It's in your archive, and it's my job to catalogue it." "Your job," Albert said, meeting his eyes, "is to catalogue records, not to understand them. There's a difference." Gerald left the office unsettled. Albert was hiding something, or protecting something, or perhaps genuinely didn't know more than family warnings passed down like folklore. He needed a different approach. The newspaper archives at the Louisiana Historical Society contained copies of the St. Bernard Gazette dating back to 1825. Gerald spent 2 full days reading through issues from 1829 to 1847, looking for any mention of Armand, unusual birth registrations, or controversies involving racial classifications. He found almost nothing. A few brief mentions. Deputy Registrar J. "Armand has confirmed the registration of 12 births this month. Standard administrative notices." But in the October 1847 issue, tucked in the local notices section, was a single paragraph. "The community mourns the passing of Mr. Jacques Armand, Deputy Registrar, whose diligent service to our parish spanned 18 years. Mr. Armand was known for his precise record-keeping and dedication to administrative accuracy. He leaves behind no immediate family. Services were held privately." No immediate family. 18 years of service. Nothing controversial, nothing suspicious. Just a bureaucrat who died and was briefly memorialized. Yet someone had sealed his personal records in wax. Someone had hidden the supplementary ledgers. Someone had told clerks to leave them alone. Gerald needed to understand what happened to those children. The next phase of research required a different kind of digging. If children born to enslaved mothers were registered as white, there should be subsequent records, sales, transfers, manumission papers, or death certificates. Gerald began cross-referencing the names from Armand's ledgers with other parish documents. Marie, born April 3, 1830, to Lisette at Belmont Plantation. Gerald searched through Belmont's records, now housed at the parish archive. The plantation had been sold in 1856, its papers transferred to county storage. He found Lisette's name in the slave inventory from 1829, She was listed as a house servant, age 22. In the 1831 inventory, a note beside her name. One child, Marie, transferred separately. Transferred separately. Not sold with the mother, as was typical for very young children. He searched for Marie in subsequent records. Nothing in Belmont's slave inventories. Nothing in sales records from neighboring plantations. But then, in a tax document from 1832, he found an entry for Belmont Plantation listing a Marie Belmont, household apprentice, under the section for free persons of color employed. Free, at age 2? Gerald traced the name forward. Marie Belmont appeared in parish records periodically. A school enrollment in 1838, unusual for free persons of color but not impossible. A witness signature on a property deed in 1851, she could write then. And finally, a marriage record in 1854 to a man named Charles Riviere, also listed as a free person of color. But here was the critical detail. Marie's race on the marriage certificate was listed as white, not free person of color. White. Gerald sat in stunned silence. A child born to an enslaved woman, somehow reclassified, somehow freed, somehow granted white status, all before age 24. He checked another name. Thomas, born April 27th, 1830. The pattern repeated. Registered as white at birth, transferred separately from his enslaved mother within 2 years, appearing later in records as a free child, then eventually as white, in adult documents. One by one, Gerald traced the 47 children through the fragmentary records available. 23 of them followed similar trajectories. The others simply vanished from the records entirely after their initial birth registration. And supervising every initial registration, J. Armand. By October 1893, Gerald had filled 6 notebooks with his findings. He worked late into the evenings, correlating dates, tracking names, mapping the movement of children across parishes and decades. Caroline worried about his health. He'd lost weight, developed dark circles under his eyes, and stopped attending church socials. "You need to show this to someone," she urged. "If what you found is real, historians should know." "It's real," Gerald said. "But I don't understand the mechanism yet. How did this happen? Who authorized it? Why these specific children?" He was missing something crucial, some connective tissue that would make the pattern coherent. The answer arrived unexpectedly, not from documents but from a person. In early November, an elderly woman named Josephine Durant came to the parish office requesting a copy of her birth record. She was 83, she told Gerald, born in St. Bernard Parish in 1810. She needed the document for a property inheritance matter in New Orleans. Gerald located her record easily. She'd been born free to free parents of color, a relatively straightforward case. As he prepared the certified copy, making polite conversation, he mentioned he was researching historical record-keeping practices. "Did you ever know a man named Jacques Armand?" he asked casually. "He was a registrar here decades ago." Josephine's hand, reaching for the document, froze in midair. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp, fixed on Gerald's face. "Why are you asking about him?" The intensity in her voice made Gerald choose his next words carefully. "I found some unusual entries in old ledgers. His name appeared frequently. I'm trying to understand the context." Josephine sat down slowly in the chair across from his desk. For a long moment, she said nothing, her fingers twisting the fabric of her shawl. "I knew Armand," she said finally. "Everyone in the colored community knew him, though we didn't speak his name often, still don't." "What did he do?" "He kept 2 sets of books." She spoke slowly, as if pulling memories from deep storage. "Official books and other books. My aunt was a midwife. She delivered babies on half the plantations in this parish. She told me things toward the end of her life, things she'd seen." Gerald leaned forward. "What kind of things?" When certain babies were born, babies with skin light enough to pass, born to enslaved women, Armand would be called, not immediately, sometimes weeks later. He'd arrive with his ledgers and examine the child. If the child was light enough, if the features were acceptable, he'd make his registration as white, Gerald said. Josephine nodded. Then the child would disappear from the plantation. Within a year, sometimes just months. The mothers were told their babies died. Some believed it, others... She paused. Others knew better but couldn't do anything. Where did the children go? That I don't know for certain. Aunt Matilda had theories. She believed they were taken north or to New Orleans, given to families who couldn't have children or who wanted servants they could claim as orphaned relatives. Light-skinned children could be raised as white, you understand, especially if the documentation said they were white from birth. The room felt colder. Gerald's methodical mind was assembling pieces into a picture he didn't want to see clearly. How many children? He asked. I couldn't say. Aunt Matilda delivered hundreds of babies over 40 years. She thought maybe 50 or 60 that Armand took interest in. But she only worked certain plantations. If he did this across the whole parish... Josephine trailed off. Did anyone try to stop him? Josephine's laugh was bitter. Stop a white official doing legal registrations? With what power? The mothers were property. The babies were property. If someone with authority decided to reclassify that property as human, as white, as free, who exactly would object? The plantation owners? The question hung in the air, rhetorical but devastating. Why would plantation owners allow it? Gerald asked. They were losing valuable. He struggled with the word. Assets. Were they? Josephine tilted her head. Think about it. A baby born too light causes problems. Other enslaved people ask questions. Overseers ask questions. Visitors notice. And if that child grows up looking white, you can't sell them easily. Can't put them to field work without raising eyebrows. Easier to make them disappear legally. Armand provided a service. He made uncomfortable problems vanish into paperwork. Gerald felt sick. The clinical logic was airtight. The systematic nature of it, the bureaucratic efficiency, was somehow more disturbing than any spontaneous cruelty. Your aunt, he said carefully. Did she ever know what happened to the children afterward? She heard stories, saw one of them years later, she thought. A young woman in New Orleans, maybe 20 years old, working as a governess for a wealthy family. The woman had a birthmark on her neck, same mark Aunt Matilda remembered from a baby she'd delivered to an enslaved woman named Ruth. But when she tried to speak to the young woman, there was no recognition. The young woman spoke perfect French, dressed in fine clothes, and looked through Aunt Matilda like she was invisible. She didn't remember. She was taken at 8 months old, according to Aunt Matilda's memory. How could she remember? For all she knew, she was exactly who her papers said she was, a white orphan raised by a charitable family. The implications cascaded through Gerald's mind. Stolen identities, erased histories, children who would never know their mothers, their origins, the truth of their own existence. Why are you telling me this? He asked Josephine. She stood slowly, collecting her certified birth document. Because you asked, and because I'm 83 years old. Everyone who knew about this directly is dead or dying. If someone is finally looking at those records, finally asking questions, maybe it's time the answers were spoken out loud. Even if nothing can be done now. She walked to the door, then paused. Armand kept those ledgers separate for a reason. He knew what he was doing was legal but wrong. That's a particular kind of evil, Mr. Hutchins, evil that fills out forms in triplicate. After she left, Gerald sat in the empty office as darkness gathered outside. He thought about those children, toddlers taken from their mothers, given new names sometimes, new families, new identities constructed from lies, and certified with official stamps. Some might argue they'd been given better lives, freedom, opportunity, a chance to escape slavery's grasp. But they'd been stolen, their mothers had grieved, and they'd been built into lies they would carry unknowingly for the rest of their lives. Gerald's research took on new urgency. He began investigating Jacques Armand's personal history, looking for context, for motivation, for the origin point of this systematic reclassification. Armand had come to Louisiana from France in 1825, age 30. He'd worked briefly as a clerk for a shipping company in New Orleans before receiving his appointment as deputy registrar in St. Bernard Parish in 1829. No wife, no children of his own, no significant property holdings. By all accounts, a minor bureaucrat living a quiet, unremarkable life. But Gerald found something else. In the archives of correspondences between parish officials, there was a letter dated March 1829, written by someone named Philip Grosvenor, a wealthy landowner who served on the parish commission. The letter recommended Armand for the deputy registrar position, praising his discretion and understanding of delicate administrative matters. Delicate administrative matters. Gerald tracked down Grosvenor's estate records. The Grosvenor family had owned Belmont Plantation, where many of the reclassified children had been born, until selling it in 1851. Philip Grosvenor had died in 1853. The pieces were connecting. Grosvenor had secured Armand's position. Armand had then provided a service, handling delicate matters, that benefited plantation owners like Grosvenor. But the scope extended beyond Belmont. Gerald's list included children from at least 12 different plantations. This wasn't one plantation owner solving a personal problem. This was an organized system. He found the next clue in banking records. Through property tax documents, Gerald discovered that Jacques Armand had maintained an account at First Louisiana Bank in New Orleans. Estate records from Armand's death showed the account had contained $40,200 at the time, an enormous sum for a parish clerk whose annual salary had been approximately $300. Where had that money come from? Gerald couldn't access detailed banking records, those were private, but the amount suggested regular payments over many years. Payments from whom? For what service? The implications were clear. Armand hadn't done this out of ideological conviction or misguided mercy. He'd been paid to reclassify children, to process them out of slavery through legal documentation, to make inconvenient situations disappear. But paid by whom? The plantation owners directly? Some intermediary organization? In January 1894, Gerald discovered the advertisements. He'd been reading through New Orleans newspapers from the 1830s and 1840s, searching for any mention of Armand or the plantations on his list. He almost missed them. They were small, usually buried in the back pages among notices for livestock sales and shipping schedules. The first one appeared in the April 1831 edition of the New Orleans Mercantile, seeking placement. Light-complexioned infant girl, excellent health, suitable for household service or adoption into respectable family. Inquiries to P.G., care of Devereux and Associates, 127 Rue Royale. P.G. Philip Grosvenor. Gerald found 6 more similar advertisements over the next 3 years. The phrasing varied, but the structure remained consistent. Light-complexioned infant, excellent health, placement sought. Inquiries directed to initials care of Devereux and Associates. He'd seen that name. Devereux. Robert Devereux, no, Devereux, had been the deputy who investigated Armand's death. The connections were forming a web. Grosvenor recommends Armand. Armand registers children as white. Children are transferred. Advertisements appear seeking placement. Devereux handles the inquiries and years later investigates Armand's death and closes the case with no criminal findings. It was a network, a quiet, bureaucratic network that had operated for nearly 2 decades. moving children from slavery into fraudulent freedom, all while maintaining meticulous legal documentation. But Gerald still couldn't answer the fundamental question: what happened to the children who were placed? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In March 1894, Gerald received a letter forwarded from the parish clerk's office. It was from a man named Edmund Porter, an attorney in Mobile, Alabama. Porter had read a brief scholarly note Gerald had published in the Louisiana Historical Quarterly about unusual record-keeping practices in antebellum parishes. Gerald had been vague, mentioning discrepancies in racial classifications without revealing the full scope of his discovery. Porter's letter was carefully worded. Dear Mr. Hutchins, your recent note regarding classification irregularities in Louisiana parish records resonates with a case I am currently managing. A client of mine, a woman of 73, recently discovered that her birth record from St. Bernard Parish contains inconsistencies with her family history as she understood it. She was told throughout her life that she was born to a white family that perished in a yellow fever epidemic, and that she was raised by adoptive relatives. However, recent examination of her papers has raised questions. If you have information regarding irregular birth registrations from St. Bernard Parish, circa 1830, 1840, I would welcome correspondence. This is a matter of significant personal importance to my client. Gerald responded immediately, asking for more details. Porter's next letter arrived within 2 weeks. My client, whom I shall call Mrs. L for privacy, possesses a birth certificate registered in St. Bernard Parish in 1832, listing her race as white and her mother as deceased at childbirth. However, she recently obtained, through family papers, a contradictory document, a bill of sale from 1833 for one female child, light-skinned, named Lily, born to Negro woman named Grace. The child's description matches details my client knows about her own early childhood. The bill is signed by a notary named J. Armand. Mrs. L is devastated and seeking to understand her true origins. J. Armand had notarized the sale. Of course he had. He wasn't just registering these children, he was facilitating their entire transfer chain. Gerald wrote back, asking if Porter could share the names involved. Another exchange of letters brought the details. The child Lily had been born at Riverside Estate in 1832. Her mother, Grace, had died in 1835 according to plantation records. The child had been sold to a family in Mobile named the Prescotts, who'd raised her as an orphaned niece. Gerald checked his ledgers. There it was, May 19, 1832, female child, Lily, mother, Grace, Negro, father unknown, race, white, Riverside Estate, registrar, J. Armand. Mrs. L was one of the 47. Over the next several months, Gerald and Porter exchanged extensive correspondence. Porter was representing Mrs. L in an attempt to claim inheritance from her biological mother's side, a futile effort legally, Porter admitted, since enslaved persons couldn't leave property. But the principle mattered to his client. She wanted acknowledgement of her true origin. Through Porter, Gerald learned what had happened to at least one of the reclassified children. Sold to a family desperate for a child, or wanting a servant they could raise without the social complications of slavery, or perhaps genuinely believing they were rescuing an orphan. The buyers were given impeccable documentation, white birth certificates signed by an official registrar. The children were young enough to have no memories. The mothers were powerless to object or search. It was trafficking, Gerald realized. Legal, documented, bureaucratically processed trafficking of children, disguised as legitimate birth registration and orphan placement. And Armand had been the architect. Gerald's work became more public in 1895 when he presented preliminary findings at the Louisiana Historical Association's annual meeting. He was careful with his language. framing it as a study of administrative irregularities in antebellum record systems. But the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. The response was mixed. Some historians were fascinated, seeing research potential. Others were hostile, suggesting Gerald was fabricating controversy or misinterpreting routine errors. One prominent scholar from Tulane dismissed the entire matter as statistical noise in a system with poor oversight. But Gerald also received letters, 7 of them over the next year, from people across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Each letter told a similar story. Family documents that contradicted official records. Elderly relatives with vague memories of children who went to live with other families. Birth certificates signed by J. Armand that didn't match family oral histories. One letter came from a woman in Natchez who'd found her grandmother's diary. The grandmother had been a free woman of color in the 1830s, employed as a seamstress. She'd written about her sister, an enslaved woman at a Louisiana plantation who'd given birth to a light-skinned daughter. The entry from 1834 read, "Louisa's baby is gone. They told her the fever took it, but there was no fever. I saw the child 2 weeks ago, healthy and strong. Now Louisa won't speak. She just stares at the wall." Another letter came from a man whose grandfather had been a blacksmith in St. Bernard Parish. The grandfather had kept a journal documenting his business transactions. One entry from 1839 noted, "Made small hinges for travel basket, special order. Customer was that French registrar fellow. Said it was for transporting documents, but the basket was lined with blankets. Strange commission. Travel baskets lined with blankets." Gerald's stomach turned. By 1896, he'd documented 73 cases, the original 47 from Armand's personal ledgers, plus 26 more he'd found by cross-referencing plantation records with Armand's official registrations. Not all followed the same pattern. Some children had been registered with race left blank, or with confusing notations like under review or pending classification. But the core group, the 47 from the supplementary ledgers, those were clear, and in every case, Jacques Armand's signature appeared. Gerald attempted to publish a full paper on his findings. 3 academic journals rejected it. The editor's responses varied, but the underlying message was consistent. Too controversial, too speculative, insufficient direct evidence of criminal intent. "You have correlation," one editor wrote, "but you cannot definitively prove conspiracy. Armand is long dead." The children, if alive, would now be in their 60s or 70s, living as white citizens with no knowledge of your research. What purpose does exposure serve except to create social disruption? The question haunted Gerald. What was he trying to accomplish? Justice for the mothers? Recognition of what had been done? Some historical footnote that would be read by scholars and forgotten? Or was he simply unable to leave the mystery unsolved? In May 1896, Gerald traveled to New Orleans to examine property records at the Notarial Archives. He was searching for any properties owned by Jacques Armand beyond his residence in St. Bernard Parish. He found one, a small warehouse near the docks, purchased in 1832 and sold in 1846. The property records included a brief description: storage facility for documents and administrative materials. Gerald located the current owner of the property. It had changed hands 4 times since Armand sold it. The current owner, a merchant named Theodore Bruneau, was happy to let Gerald examine the premises for a small fee. The warehouse was narrow and unremarkable, wedged between 2 larger commercial buildings. Bruneau explained it was primarily used for storing imported textiles now. Previous owner used it for similar purposes, he said. Before that I couldn't tell you. Would you mind if I examined the structure? Gerald asked. Sometimes old buildings have historical materials left behind. Bruneau shrugged. Look wherever you like. Just don't damage anything. Gerald spent 3 hours inspecting the warehouse. The ground floor revealed nothing unusual. Empty wooden crates, remnants of textile wrappings, dust. But there was a small upper floor, accessed by a narrow staircase. The upper room was perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet. 2 small windows, now painted over, faced an alley. The wooden floor showed signs of old water damage in one corner. Otherwise, the space was empty. Gerald walked the perimeter slowly, testing floorboards, examining walls. He was about to give up when he noticed something odd about the chimney breast. The brickwork there was slightly different. Newer mortar, subtle color variation. He pressed against the bricks experimentally. One shifted. Working carefully, Gerald removed 6 bricks from a section about 4 feet up from the floor. Behind them was a cavity, and inside the cavity was a leather satchel, stiff with age and moisture damage. His heart pounding, Gerald extracted the satchel and carried it to the window for better light. The leather was cracked and moldy, but the contents were protected inside an oilcloth wrapper. Papers, folded documents, and a small notebook. The notebook's cover was unmarked. Gerald opened it gently, mindful of the brittle pages. The first page, in neat handwriting, read, "Private Record of Placements, J. Armand, 1829-1847, to be destroyed upon my death." But it hadn't been destroyed. It had been hidden. The notebook contained names, dates, and destinations. Each entry followed a format: child name, birth date, mother, birth plantation, placed with, location, date of transfer, fee received. Gerald's hands trembled as he read. Marie, April 3rd, 1830, Lisette, Belmont, Mr. and Mrs. Laurent Duchamp, New Orleans, June 1830, $200 Thomas, April 27, 1830, Patience, Belmont, Mr. Henri Valois, Household Service, Baton Rouge, July 1830, $150 Rose, June 14, 1830, Dinah, Riverside, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Beaufort, Mobile, August 1830, $225. The list continued. 79 entries in total, more than Gerald had documented, each with a price, each with a destination, each representing a child separated from their mother and given a manufactured identity. The fees varied from $150 to $400, apparently based on the child's age and complexion. Younger and lighter commanded higher prices. But there was more. Clipped to the back of the notebook were letters, 7 of them, faded but legible. They were inquiries from prospective families asking about acquiring a suitable child for domestic upbringing or adopting an orphaned infant in need of Christian home. One letter, dated February 1835, from a couple in Charleston, was particularly chilling in its clinical tone. "Dear Mr. Armand, we received your name through Mr. Grosvenor as someone who might assist with a delicate family matter. We have been unable to conceive children after 10 years of marriage. We are seeking to acquire a female infant, preferably under 6 months of age, of light complexion suitable for raising as our natural daughter. We understand documentation can be arranged to reflect legitimate birth. We are prepared to compensate appropriately for your services and discretion. Please advise availability." Armand had replied, apparently because a notation in his notebook listed Eleanor, Nov, 1835, Josephine, Oakwood, Mr. and Mrs. R. Winslow, Charleston, 375. This wasn't opportunistic crime. This was a business. Armand had created a market for children who could pass as white, connecting desperate or unscrupulous families with enslaved infants, facilitating the transfers with legal documentation, and profiting from the transactions. The supplementary ledgers weren't mistakes or anomalies. They were receipts. Gerald faced an ethical dilemma. Publishing this information would be explosive. It would expose a criminal enterprise, yes, but it would also potentially devastate living people, elderly men and women who'd spent their entire lives believing they were white, who'd built families and reputations on identities that had been fabricated before they could even speak. Mrs. L. in Mobile had chosen to investigate her origins. But how many others would want that choice? How many would prefer never to know? Carolyn listened as he wrestled with the decision, pacing their small living room late into the night. "You're asking whether truth is worth the harm it might cause," she said finally. "Yes, I can't answer that for you, but I'll ask you this. If those mothers could speak now, what would they want?" Gerald stopped pacing. He thought about Lisette, who'd lost Marie, about Grace, who'd lost Lily, about the unnamed women whose children had been taken in the night, who'd been told their babies died, who'd carried that grief for the rest of their lives. "They'd want their children to know," he said quietly. "They'd want the truth told. Then you have your answer." Gerald's comprehensive report, Systematic Racial Reclassification in Antebellum Louisiana, the Armand Ledgers, 1829-1847, was published in June 1897 by the American Historical Review, one of the few journals willing to handle the controversial material. The response was immediate and fierce. Several Louisiana families threatened legal action, claiming Gerald was defaming their genealogies with unsubstantiated accusations. The St. Bernard Parish Commission issued a formal statement questioning the authenticity of the documents Gerald had cited. 3 prominent historians published rebuttals, arguing that Gerald had misinterpreted routine administrative variations. But others took his research seriously. Genealogical societies began investigating, journalists wrote articles, and slowly, very slowly, more evidence emerged. A woman in Virginia discovered her grandfather's birth certificate had been altered. Original ink showed Negro scratched out and replaced with white, signed by J. Armand. A family in Kentucky found letters in their attic suggesting their great-grandmother had been obtained through a charitable organization in New Orleans in 1836. A historian in South Carolina uncovered similar patterns of reclassification in other parishes, though none as systematic as Armand's operation. The academic debate raged for years. Some scholars argued Gerald had exposed a significant and previously undocumented aspect of antebellum racial dynamics. Others insisted he'd inflated coincidental errors into conspiratorial fantasy. What no one could dispute was the existence of the ledgers themselves, the pattern of registrations, and the correlation with advertisements and transfers. Gerald continued his research until his death in 1908. By then, he'd identified 112 children who'd been processed through Armand's system. He'd tracked 34 of them into adulthood through various records. Most had lived as white citizens, completely unaware of their origins. Several had married into prominent families. At least 2 had owned slaves themselves. That last fact haunted Gerald particularly. Children stolen from slavery, raised as white, eventually becoming slave owners. The cruel irony was almost incomprehensible. In his final notebook, written during the illness that would claim him, Gerald reflected on what he'd uncovered. "I set out to catalog records and instead cataloged lives. Lives stolen, lives fabricated, lives built on foundations of lies. Jacques Armand appears in history as a minor functionary, dying alone and unremarkable. But his legacy is walking around in the bodies of people who don't know they carry it. His crime was paperwork, his weapon was a pen. And his victims included not only the mothers who lost their children, but the children themselves who lost their truth. I am asked often if my research accomplished anything. I cannot say. The mothers are all dead. The children, now elderly if still living, will likely never know. The system that enabled Armand is long abolished, but the documentation remains. And documentation, I have learned, is its own kind of testimony. It speaks when voices are silenced. It preserves what power wants forgotten. Whether anyone listens is beyond my control. The ledgers Gerald discovered remain in the Louisiana State Archives today, catalogued under St. Bernard Parish Administrative Records, Supplementary Materials, 1829-1847. Researchers can access them by request, though few do. The notebook from the warehouse, Gerald's most significant find, was donated to the archive by his estate in 1909, along with all his research notes and correspondence. Occasionally, someone requests the materials, usually genealogists tracing family trees, sometimes historians researching antebellum Louisiana, rarely journalists investigating historical injustices. They all find the same thing Gerald found. 79 children documented in Armand's private notebook, 47 in the supplementary ledgers, and countless others implied by the gaps in plantation records and the pattern of transfers. And in every single entry, one name appears as the certifying authority, the notary, the registrar who made it all legal, J. Armand. In 1983, a graduate student at Louisiana State University named Rebecca Chen was researching racial classification systems for her dissertation. She accessed the Armand materials and began cross-referencing them with genealogical databases that had become available through computerization. She found something Gerald Hutchins had never had the technology to discover. Using birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and census data, Rebecca traced the descendants of 12 children from Armand's ledgers. Not the children themselves. All were long deceased, but their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. She estimated that those 12 children alone had approximately 2,400 living descendants as of 1983. 2,400 people living across the United States, most identifying as white, none aware that their great-great-grandfather or great-great-grandmother had been born to an enslaved woman and processed through Jacques Armand's reclassification system. Rebecca sat in the archive reading room, staring at her computer printouts, wrestling with the same ethical question Gerald had faced 90 years earlier. Should she publish this? She decided against it. Her dissertation examined the administrative mechanisms of racial classification without identifying specific modern families. The Armand case became a footnote, a documented example of systematic reclassification, mentioned briefly, then left in the historical record for others to find or ignore as they chose. The truth about Jacques Armand's operation remains incompletely understood. Why did he start? Did he believe he was helping the children, or was it purely mercenary? Was he coerced into the role, or did he design the system himself? No personal letters survive to reveal his thoughts. No diary explains his motivations. Only the ledgers remain, cold, precise, methodical entries recording children transformed from enslaved to free, from black to white, from one identity to another, all with the stroke of a pen. The mothers' voices are even more absent. Not one testified, not one left a written account, not one was asked by any official body what they thought or felt or wanted. Their children were taken, recorded, and erased from their lives, and the system that enabled it never required the mother's consent or even acknowledgement. History remembers them now only as names in a column. Lisette, Grace, Dinah, Esther, Patience, Josephine. Women who gave birth and then lost their children not to death, which was grief enough, but to a legal fiction that rendered them non-existent as mothers. There's a box in the Louisiana State Archives filed under reference code SBP 1829 SUP that contains the 4 supplementary ledgers Gerald Hutchins found in 1893. The box is marked with a note added by an archivist in 1974. Contains sensitive genealogical material. Researchers requesting access must sign disclosure agreement. Inside the front cover of the first ledger, someone, perhaps Gerald, perhaps an archivist, has placed a small card with typed text. These records document children born between 1829 and 1847 who were registered with racial classifications inconsistent with their maternal lineage. The individuals named herein were reclassified through legal processes managed by Deputy Registrar Jacques Armand. Descendants of these individuals may be unaware of the circumstances of their ancestors' births. Handle this information with appropriate sensitivity. Appropriate sensitivity. As if there's an appropriate way to handle the revelation that identities were stolen, lives were fabricated, and mother's grief was buried in bureaucratic files labeled supplementary. The ledgers themselves are unremarkable objects. Brown leather, fading ink, yellowed pages. They look like any other administrative record from the period. Nothing about their physical appearance suggests the weight of what they contain. But when you open them and read the entries, line after line, page after page, year after year, always ending with that same signature, the systematic nature of it becomes visceral. This wasn't chaos or individual cruelty. This was organized, documented, compensated efficiency. Evil, as Josephine Durant had observed, that filled out forms in triplicate. In 2003, a genealogist working on a family tree for a client in Atlanta discovered an inconsistency. The client's great-great-grandmother, Martha, had a birth certificate from St. Bernard Parish dated 1841, listing her race as white and her parents as unknown, orphaned at birth. But attached to the certificate, apparently by accident when documents were copied decades earlier, was a one-page fragment from what appeared to be a plantation inventory. The fragment listed, birth, female child to Hannah, light complexion, reported to registrar. The birth dates matched. The genealogist, following professional ethics, shared the finding with her client. The client requested no further investigation. The genealogist filed her notes and moved on to other projects. But she made one additional check before closing the file. She looked up who had signed Martha's birth certificate. J. Armand. She'd never heard the name before, so she did a quick search through historical databases. She found Gerald Hutchins's 1897 paper. She read it in one sitting, then went back and looked at her client's documents again. Martha was one of the 79. The genealogist wrote a brief email to the Louisiana State Archives, asking if the Armand materials had been digitized. They had not. Budget constraints, the archivist explained, perhaps someday. Someday the ledgers might be scanned, made searchable, cross-referenced with national genealogical databases. Someday thousands of people might discover their ancestors were processed through Jacques Armand's system. But not yet. For now, the ledgers sit in their box, in a climate-controlled vault, waiting for researchers who rarely come. The last known person to fully review all the Armand materials was a documentary filmmaker in 2011. She'd been developing a project about hidden histories of slavery in Louisiana. She spent 2 weeks with the ledgers, photographing pages, taking notes, planning interviews. The documentary was never completed. Funding fell through, she explained later, and the subject matter proved too legally complicated. Families threatened lawsuits before a single frame was shot. Her production company shelved the project, but she kept her research notes. In an interview years later, she reflected, "What disturbed me most wasn't the evil of it. We know slavery was evil. It was the paperwork. Someone designed forms for this. Someone created procedures. Someone sat in an office and thought through the logistics. How to document the theft of a child. How to create a legal identity from nothing. How to make a human being disappear and reappear as someone completely different. And then they did it 79 times that we know of. Maybe hundreds of times total. And they filed everything properly. That's perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Armand case. It wasn't hidden in the moment. It was official, recorded, filed in government archives. The hiding came later when someone, we don't know who, sealed the ledgers and stashed them in a corner. But even that wasn't destruction. Whoever hid them chose to preserve them, locked away but intact. Why? Guilt? A sense that the records might someday matter? Simple bureaucratic habit. Documents aren't destroyed, they're filed. We'll likely never know. Jacques Armand died in November 1847 in his home in St. Bernard Parish. The coroner who examined him noted no signs of violence or obvious disease. He was found at his desk, pen in hand, a partially completed entry before him. The entry, preserved in the coroner's report, read, November 15th, 1847, male child, unnamed. Mother, Rachel, Negro. Father, unknown. Race. The race field was blank. Whatever Armand had been about to write, death interrupted him. The child was never registered. No subsequent record exists of a baby born to Rachel at any St. Bernard plantation in November 1847. Either the child died, or someone else completed the registration without Armand's involvement, or the birth itself was never officially documented. It was Armand's last entry, his final act in a system he'd maintained for 18 years. He was buried in the St. Bernard Parish Cemetery in a plot with no surviving stone. Records show the location, but the marker has long since disappeared or eroded beyond recognition. No descendants claimed the plot. No one maintained it. Jacques Armand exists now primarily as a signature on documents and a name in historical papers. A man who processed children through paperwork, who turned human beings into transactions, who built a business from separated families, and who died at his desk in the middle of yet another entry. The mother's stories are harder to trace. Enslaved women rarely appear in historical records except as property inventories. We know their names only because Armand documented them as the mothers of children he reclassified. Lisette, who gave birth to Marie in 1830, appears in Belmont plantation records until 1844. Then her name vanishes, sold, possibly, or dead, or simply recorded elsewhere under different documentation. Grace, who gave birth to Lily in 1832, is noted as deceased in 1835. Cause of death unlisted. Dinah, mother of Rose, appears in records through 1852. A notation beside her name in an 1843 inventory reads, age approximately 35, field worker, reduced productivity. No further details. These fragmentary traces are all that remain. Women who carried children, gave birth, and then had those children taken and legally erased. Whether they knew their children survived, whether they hoped for reunion, whether they mourned them as dead or lost or stolen, none of that was recorded. The system didn't require their grief to be documented, so it wasn't. There's a question researchers occasionally ask when studying the Armand case. What happened to the children who were raised as white? Did they live better lives than they would have as enslaved people? It's an impossible question to answer, and many argue it's the wrong question entirely. It presumes the only two options were enslavement or theft, when the actual moral option, abolishing slavery, existed as an alternative their society simply refused to choose. But the question persists because the answer is complicated. Some of the children Armand placed were raised in comfortable circumstances, educated, given opportunities they would have been denied under slavery. Marie, the first entry in Armand's notebook, grew up in New Orleans with the Duchamp family. Records suggest she learned to read and write, married a free man of color, and lived to age 68. Others faced harder paths. Gerald's research suggested at least 11 of the reclassified children were essentially bonded servants, legally free but practically bound to the families who'd purchased them through debt, manipulation, or simple lack of alternatives. And all of them, regardless of their material circumstances, lived lies. They didn't know they were living lies, which perhaps made it easier, but the truth remained hidden beneath legal documents and false narratives. In 1999, a historical preservation society in St. Bernard Parish erected a small memorial in the county courthouse. The plaque reads, in memory of the enslaved mothers and children of St. Bernard Parish, whose families were separated through both illegal and legal means. May their names be remembered and their stories acknowledged. It doesn't mention Jacques Armand by name. It doesn't detail his system or the scope of the reclassifications. It's deliberately vague, a compromise between competing desires, to acknowledge what happened without specifying who was harmed or how. Some local historians argued even that vague memorial was inappropriate, dredging up painful history, they said, that couldn't be remedied and only caused division. Others insisted it didn't go far enough, that naming Armand and documenting the specific crimes was necessary for true historical reckoning. The memorial was vandalized twice in its first year. Both times it was repaired. Now it sits quietly in the courthouse lobby, passed by hundreds of people each week, most of whom don't pause to read it. The last known verified descendant to learn of their connection to Armand's system was a man named David Pritchard, who discovered the truth in 2007 while researching his family genealogy for his grandchildren. David was 71, a retired school teacher in Mississippi. He'd grown up believing his great-grandmother Elizabeth had been an orphan raised by a kind family in Louisiana. That was the story passed down through 4 generations. But when David obtained Elizabeth's actual birth records for his genealogy project, he found inconsistencies. Her birth certificate listed her race as white, her mother as unknown, and her birth location as St. Bernard Parish, 1838. The registrar's signature, J. Armand. Something about the name tickled his memory. He searched online and found references to Gerald Hutchins's research. Then he found the archived ledgers, now partially digitized, and saw an entry. Elizabeth, March 12, 1838. Miriam, Riverside, Mr. and Mrs. Stephen Landry, Baton Rouge, April 1838. 200 D. His great-grandmother had been born to an enslaved woman named Miriam, then sold as an infant for $280 to the family who'd raised her. David spent months processing this information. He experienced, he later wrote in a personal essay, a kind of identity vertigo. Everything he'd believed about his family history, his heritage, his ancestry, was suddenly uncertain. He was white. He'd lived 71 years as a white man, but his great-grandmother had been born to a black enslaved woman. What did that make him? What was the truth of his identity? He didn't publicize his discovery widely. He told his children and grandchildren, shared the documents, and left them to decide what it meant for their own sense of self. Some were fascinated, eager to research further. Others were uncomfortable, unsure how to integrate this information into their self-understanding. David wrote, "I don't know if learning this truth made my life better or worse. I only know it's the truth, and I prefer truth to comfortable lies, even when the truth is this complicated. The question that haunts the Armand case is simple but unanswerable. How many were there really? Gerald Hutchins documented 112. Armand's personal notebook listed 79, but those were only the cases with surviving documentation. How many ledgers were destroyed? How many entries were made in books that were lost, burned, or deliberately eliminated? If Armand maintained his operation for 18 years, averaging 4 to 5 placements per year based on documented cases, the total could easily exceed 200 children. If other registrars in other parishes operated similar systems, and evidence suggests at least 3 others did, though on smaller scales, the total across Louisiana might reach several hundred. And if those children each had descendants, if family trees branched and spread over 6 or 7 generations, the mathematics become staggering. Thousands of people, possibly tens of thousands, walking around today with no idea that their ancestry includes a woman whose child was stolen and legally transformed into someone else. Is it important that they know? Does it matter now? Historians disagree. Some argue that acknowledging these hidden histories is essential to understanding the full scope of slavery's mechanisms and legacies. Others contend that revealing information that disrupts contemporary families' identities serves no productive purpose. The question has no clear answer. But the ledgers remain factual and indifferent. They don't care whether we read them or ignore them. They simply exist, preserved in acid-free boxes waiting in climate-controlled darkness. There's one more detail worth mentioning. In 2015, an archivist conducting routine preservation review of the Armand materials noticed something that previous researchers had missed. On the final page of the last supplementary ledger, barely visible because the ink had faded almost to invisibility, was a handwritten note. Using specialized imaging technology, the archivist was able to enhance and read the text. God forgive me for what necessity required. Let these names stand as witness to what commerce demands of men's souls. J.A. November 1847. The handwriting matched Armand's signature. The date was weeks before his death. Was this remorse? Justification? Simple record-keeping? We'll never know. Jacques Armand took his interior life to the grave, leaving behind only the external evidence. Ledgers, signatures, and 79 children whose origins were obscured by the very documents that were supposed to preserve truth. The story of the Armand ledgers isn't about one villain performing dramatic evil. It's about a system that functioned so smoothly it generated its own documentation. It's about how the legal and the criminal can be identical when the law itself is built on injustice. It's about children who became someone else before they were old enough to know they were anyone at all. And it's about the peculiar cruelty of bureaucracy, how forms and signatures and official seals can transform the theft of a child into a properly processed transaction, complete with receipts. The ledgers still exist. The system that created them is gone. The children are long dead. Their mothers are forgotten except as names in a register. But the descendants live on, most unaware they're part of this history. And in the archives of Louisiana, in boxes that smell faintly of vinegar and rust and time, one name appears on page after page, entry after entry, year after year.